Thank you, Melissa, for the warm welcome. Thank you all for coming out on this beautiful afternoon here in this wonderful space, and I thank the Rappahannock Nation for the opportunity to talk about the Declaration here. I'm so pleased to be in Virginia. As Melissa mentioned, I am a William & Mary PhD, so this is actually the first stop of my book tour talking about when the Declaration of Independence was news in Virginia. And what a lovely space to be with all of you. I like to begin talking about the Declaration by using two images which are hopefully familiar to most of you who are looking at them. On the left, you see the handwritten parchment copy of the Declaration of Independence. And on the right, you see John Trumbull's painting called Declaration of Independence. These are two pretty iconic images. They seem very clean, very clear-cut, very straightforward. They are both, to an extent, imagined. Let me explain. The image that is the signed parchment copy, the image I was showing you was not actually the signed parchment. You can see that on the right here. The parchment, which is in the collections of the National Archives in Washington, D.C., has faded significantly over time. And so what you're looking at is actually a high-resolution image, but it's very illegible. The image on the left is what is more familiar to us. That's the image you'll see on posters, on book covers, including mine. That's the Declaration font, which you'll see a lot during this 250th year. And that is an engraving which was created in 1823, by which time the parchment was already beginning to fade. And this engraving exactly replicates what the handwritten and signed copy of the Declaration looks like, but it also creates this sense of legibility which no longer exists for the original document. Additionally, the signed parchment at the very top is dated in Congress, July 4, 1776, and this gives the impression that the Declaration of Independence was signed on July 4th. And that is not correct. In fact, the parchment copy did not exist on July 4th. The Continental Congress made the decision later in July to create a parchment copy which the delegates could sign. But on July 4th, their attention was focused on publishing the news of independence. Additionally, at the bottom of the parchment, we have 56 signatures representing a group of 56 men who were never in the same room at the same time. So it gives this false impression of all of these signers lining up to sign the Declaration. But in fact, the group of delegates represents a mix of men who voted for independence, men who voted against independence, and delegates who were not even members of the Continental Congress at the time that independence was declared. Here I've crossed out the names of the individuals who were not in Philadelphia when the signing of the parchment copy began on August 2nd. So the names that are crossed out in red, they were not in the room, and that takes a few notable people off the list. For example, Richard Henry Lee and George Wythe of Virginia were both not in Philadelphia on August 2nd. They had returned home to Virginia to work on the Virginia Constitution, and they did not return to Philadelphia until after August 2nd, and so they signed later. What's interesting about the Virginia delegation is that you can see for the other delegations where someone signed later, their name is at the bottom of the list of their particular state. But for Virginia, the first Virginian to sign the parchment copy of the Declaration on August 2nd was Thomas Jefferson. And he left room above his name for Richard Henry Lee and George Wythe to sign the parchment when they returned to Philadelphia. This is the Jefferson who literally put author of the Declaration of Independence on his tombstone. And yet, he made this decision to leave space above his name for the elder statesmen and his mentors in the Virginia delegation to sign when they returned to Philadelphia. He left so much space that poor Carter Braxton's name is squished at the bottom of the parchment and completely illegible by this point. So that gives you a sense of the story behind the parchment. It's a lot more complex than you might imagine. Now, John Trumbull's painting Trumbull worked on for decades to secure the likenesses of different delegates. If he came close to depicting any particular moment, it would have been June 28th, 1776. And that's the day when the drafting committee of 5 men, presented their draft to the rest of the Congress in anticipation of the debate about whether to declare independence resuming on the following Monday, July 1st. They had taken a 3-week postponement to try to get a sense of whether the people wanted independence, and they were set to resume debate on Monday. So you'll sometimes say memes that have like Thomas Jefferson, oh crap, that's due tomorrow, July 3rd, 1776. That's not quite accurate. They were actually ahead of schedule. Now, if we zoom into this painting, we see some of the same issues as with the parchment. For example, in the left corner of the painting, George Wythe and Richard Henry Lee have front row seats, and neither of them were there. So they were painted in these prominent positions by Trumbull, kind of, giving the sense that they were in the room, but they in fact were in Virginia. And then sort of looking up at an angle in the background, you can see Charles Carroll, one of Maryland's delegates, remembered for being the only Catholic signer of the Declaration, and also the longest-lived signer because he outlived both Jefferson and Adams. Charles Carroll was elected to the Continental Congress on July 4th, so he was definitely not in the room on June 28th. All of this gives a sense, which I try to convey in my book, that publishing the news of independence to the world was messy work. And I mean messy in 2 senses of the word. First, there's messiness in terms of communication. Things did not go as smoothly as we might expect for a document which has had the staying power of the Declaration of Independence. There are less than efficient methods of getting the Declaration to different places, especially when we think about Europe and the diplomatic stakes of the United States being presented to the world. But I also mean messy in the material sense. There's a reason why there's ink splatters on the cover of my book. There's ink splatters and grimy paper and fingerprints and typos, and there's all this material messiness, which again, we don't tend to think of with a document that is as sacred to Americans as the Declaration is. The timeline of the book stretches from May 1776 to January 1777. And so this is about a 9-month period of time. And in fact, the book begins almost exactly 250 years ago this week. So if you're really interested in reading along with what happened in 1776, it's a good time to start. But I begin in May because it's the first moment where the Continental Congress issues a Declaration of Independence in the eyes of some people. It's a resolution. It's not the final declaration. But some people, both in Congress and outside of Congress, think, oh, this is it. This is the Declaration. Then the book stretches through the summer and getting to the actual formal Declaration of Independence, into the fall, and then all the way to January 1777, which is when a particular copy of the Declaration was created, which marks the end of the period of time when the Declaration was news, and we'll get to that. Now, the resolution which the Continental Congress issued on May 15th, 1776, called for new representative governments in each of the colonies. This was a step that some colonies had already taken or were in the process of taking, but the Continental Congress made this effort to bring everyone onto the same page so that everyone was working toward getting rid of their vestiges of royal government, getting rid of the British royal governors, and creating new representative governments as made sense for the particular situations in each colony. Now, on that same date, something else happens. Coincidentally, in Williamsburg, Virginia, I love coincidences of timing in the book, and so the fact that we have 2 May 15th resolutions is pretty delightful when you think about the timeline of things. So while the Continental Congress was thinking about representative governments, the Virginia Convention in Williamsburg was thinking about not only a new Constitution and Declaration of Rights for Virginia, but also sending new instructions to their delegates in Philadelphia. And these instructions called for three things: independence, confederation among the colonies, and treaties with foreign powers. So in the span of one day, the Virginia Convention called for 5 documents: Virginia Constitution, Declaration of Rights, and then the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and a model treaty to use with other nations. This event was immediately celebrated in the Virginia Gazette, and we see something really interesting here in terms of the materiality. This is Alexander Purdy's Virginia Gazette. Both newspapers being printed in Williamsburg at this time had the title of Virginia Gazette, which makes for some confusion. But this is Purdy's, and you can see in his masthead on May 10th, 1776, he has the Royal Coat of Arms of Virginia. This was what had decorated his masthead for a long time and was pretty standard practice for colonial newspapers. This is what the masthead looked like on May 17th, exactly 250 years ago, when he printed the news that the 13 united colonies, united we stand, divided we fall. That there's this sentiment of, we're all in this together now, because the Virginia Convention has sent these new instructions proposing, not just suggesting, not just considering the idea of independence, but saying we need to formally debate whether or not to declare independence. And so I love this sort of material reflection of what was happening in Williamsburg. In this newspaper, Purdy also reported on what exactly transpired in Williamsburg after these resolutions took place. And he says that the resolutions sending new instructions to Philadelphia were read aloud, and then the following toasts were given: to the American independent states, to the Grand Congress of the United States and their respective legislatures, and then to General Washington, and victory to the American arms. There was also a new flag raised at the Capitol in Williamsburg, getting rid of the British flag, raising a new Union flag, which waved upon the Capitol during the whole ceremony. And then the soldiers partook of the refreshments prepared for them by the affection of their countrymen. So it was a nice community gathering. And the evening concluded with illuminations, with fireworks and other demonstrations of joy. So we can see here this celebration happening in Williamsburg, not because of the Declaration of Independence, but because of the step being taken toward it. I like to think of what the Virginia Convention gave to the Continental Congress as a to-do list. Independence, confederation, foreign treaties. These were the items on the to-do list. And they were being thought of as completely intertwined with one another. The Declaration of Independence was not supposed to do everything. These 3 documents were supposed to work in concert with each other. There was also considerable debate about which of these things should come first. So some of the delegates who we remember as being against independence, people like John Dickinson, I would argue were actually against independence first out of this list. They're thinking about the strategy of, well, shouldn't we have something holding all of us together before we separate from Great Britain? Shouldn't we let France know that we're planning on declaring independence before we actually do so? So there's a lot of consideration of this to-do list as these documents are being drafted and speeches are being prepared, voicing one opinion or another. The reason why we don't think of these 3 things as being interconnected anymore is because they all happened at different moments. So the Declaration of Independence happened first. The model treaty, which could be applied to other nations, was ready later in 1776. But the first treaties did not go into effect until 1778. And then the Articles of Confederation took the longest because of the need for ratification, for getting the people's consent to this new plan of government. And so ultimately, the Articles were ratified in 1781, didn't work, and so we have a Constitutional Convention in 1787, and that's the document that the Declaration sits alongside in the rotunda of the National Archives. Now, at the same time that these three things, independence, confederation, and foreign treaties, are being considered, there's still this idea of each colony needs to have a new government, a new constitution. And in the words of Thomas Jefferson, it was almost better to not have a new government at all than to create a new bad government. The stakes were really high for the men who were tasked with creating these new colony-level constitutions. And so what happens that you have the political elites are kind of split between where they want to be at this particular moment. People like Thomas Jefferson really wanted to be at home. They didn't want to be in the Continental Congress. They wanted to be working on the Constitution for their new home colony. If you had given Jefferson the choice between drafting the Virginia Constitution and drafting the Declaration, he would have picked the Constitution. He was working on it even though no one had asked him to. And the first drafts of the Declaration are pulled from what he had been creating for Virginia. And we see other members of Congress like Richard Henry Lee and George Wythe who make the choice to return home rather than taking part in these deliberations about independence. Here you can see one of the copies of the committee draft of the Declaration of Independence. So Thomas Jefferson was the principal author of the Declaration. He was the first one to put words on paper and to edit those words before sending them on to the rest of the committee for them to weigh in. And at the end of the process of drafting the Declaration, Jefferson created these fair copies, clean manuscript copies, which he sent out to his friends who were not in Philadelphia, including Richard Henry Lee and George Wythe. And his intention in doing this was basically fishing for compliments. He thought that the final version of the Declaration that was approved by the Continental Congress was not as good as the committee draft. And so he wanted to send the committee draft along with the final printed version to people like Richard Henry Lee and ask them to weigh in on it, or at least let them know what might have been. And Richard Henry Lee gives Jefferson the response he's looking for. He receives the draft alongside the final printed declaration in about mid-July 1776. And he writes back to Jefferson saying, "I wish sincerely, as well for the honor of Congress as for that of the states, that the manuscript had not been mangled as it is. It is wonderful and passing pitiful that the rage of change should be so unhappily applied. However, the thing is in its nature so good that no cookery can spoil the dish for the palates of freemen." The thing was what was most important. They had declared independence. It almost didn't matter what was in the Declaration itself, because they had taken this step, which had been so long under consideration and which people like Lee and Jefferson had been pushing for. So Lee gives a little bit of assurance that it doesn't matter what the final product was. It doesn't matter how mangled it is. The thing itself is what's most important. Now, we know what was in the draft Declaration of Independence, but very few people in 1776 knew. And in fact, what was in the draft was not made public for 30 years. The draft Declaration of Independence was not published until 1806, and it was published under pretty gruesome circumstances. George Wythe had been murdered by his grandnephew, poisoned by arsenic, lived long enough to write his grandnephew out of his will, but his papers go to his lawyer to kind of deal with, and somehow the copy of the Declaration, which Jefferson had sent to Wythe in 1776, ends up in the hands of Thomas Ritchie, the printer in Richmond, big Jefferson fan, who had been itching to get his hands on the draft Declaration of Independence, and immediately publishes it in June 1806. You can see Ritchie's newspaper as well as the manuscript copy that Wythe had. This is the first time that people find out for certain what was in the draft declaration versus the final version. And the context here is critical because it's 1806. Thomas Jefferson is the president of the United States, widely known to be the author of the Declaration. And also, one of the parts of the draft which has received the most attention through time was the final grievance in the list of grievances about King George III, which blamed him for the colony's reliance on the transatlantic slave trade. That trade was about to be abolished in 1808. So there's this very different context for reading the draft at that time versus 30 years earlier in 1776. So it's an important reminder that at the time, when the Declaration was news, people only knew what was in the final product. And also, Thomas Jefferson's name was not associated with it. The names that traveled with the Declaration as it spread were John Hancock as president of the Continental Congress and Charles Thomson as secretary. Here you can see what the final printed version of the Declaration looked like. This is a broadside, so a poster-sized printing of the Declaration, created by John Dunlap, a Northern Irish immigrant printer, whose office was a few blocks away from Independence Hall in Philadelphia. And his team worked through the night of July 4th into the day on July 5th to create probably a few hundred of these broadsides to be distributed through official and unofficial channels. So John Hancock would have had a whole stack of these to send out to each of the states and to send to George Washington at the head of the Continental Army. The Congress also attempted to send a copy overseas to their secret agent in France. But then delegates also sent Dunlap broadsides to their friends, their family members. This is the first, but by no means the last, printing of the Declaration. Just to give you a sense of how the text is oriented on Dunlap's broadside, you can see the first two paragraphs are the preamble of the Declaration. And that's where you'll find the parts which are most familiar to all of us today. That's where you see all men are created equal, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's all up front. So if you go to a public reading of the Declaration for the 250th, don't zone out after that part, because the next part is the longest part of the text and also what is least familiar to us 250 years later. And that's the list of grievances about King George III, which in the final version approved by the Continental Congress is a list of 27 grievances, most of which begin, he has, referring to the king. So it does become a little bit repetitive. But all of them are making these points about the necessity of declaring independence. And then the final paragraph was the actual Declaration of Independence itself. That's where we have the resolution, which was building on what the Virginia Convention had proposed back on May 15th. This marks the transition from dependent British colonies to the free and independent United States of America. So everything that came before that final paragraph could have looked different. It didn't have to have this structure. But we can give Thomas Jefferson credit for coming up with this structure of a preamble of natural rights, and then a list of grievances about tyrannical government, and then a final declaration. Because this structure was then applied by other nations as well as other civil rights movements all through the last 250 years. So this is the origins of a genre. The first public readings of the Declaration took place in the greater Philadelphia area on Monday, July 8th, 1776, which was Election Day in Pennsylvania to choose representatives who would work on a new constitution for Pennsylvania. So you're getting a sense of how overworked everyone is at this particular moment trying to come up with these foundational documents. You can see here John Nixon, who was the reader of the Declaration outside of Independence Hall in Philadelphia. He was the colonel of a battalion of Pennsylvania Associators, militiamen. He also, by John Adams' account, had a really annoying voice. And in the time before amplification, maybe you need the guy with the annoying voice that'll carry over the crowd. So we know that he did the reading of the Declaration, but we tend to focus on the reader more than the audience. And in the case of the reading that took place in Philadelphia on July 8th, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of people in attendance. And one of the people who was in the crowd was James Forten. And if you take a look at his dates, you'll notice he was a child. He was 9 years old when he heard the Declaration read aloud on July 8th, 1776. James Forten went on to become one of the most successful Black entrepreneurs in Philadelphia, as well as a leading advocate for abolition. And he remembered back to hearing the Declaration as a child as being a sort of motivator for him. We can see it inspiring his trajectory. And so we have to kind of extrapolate out from James Forten's experience to other people who didn't leave a record of, hearing the Declaration for the first time. And so we can assume that there were other children in the crowd. There were other free Black people. There were women. There were indentured servants and enslaved laborers within earshot. In the case of the reading in Philadelphia, at the other end of the block was the Walnut Street Jail. So prisoners were within earshot, including some people who had been imprisoned because of their loyalty to the king. So the crowds were much larger and more diverse than we might necessarily think about. The Declaration was also printed immediately in newspapers, beginning with Benjamin Towne's Pennsylvania Evening Post on Saturday, July 6th. The Declaration was printed in every active newspaper in the United States, and it looks a little different seeing it in the columns of a newspaper instead of as a sort of poster-sized, one-column setup. But this would have been a way that many people, especially in more rural locations, would have learned the news of independence. They would have seen it alongside other pieces of news from Philadelphia and other places. The Declaration was also translated within days of July 4th. This is a German broadside printing of the Declaration. The Declaration was also printed in the biweekly German newspaper in Philadelphia. And as someone descended from German Americans living in the Philadelphia area in 1776, I think about these printings a lot and the idea that the Declaration was a multilingual document from the very beginning. It was being translated for people to access in the language in which they lived their everyday civic lives. And so you wouldn't expect the Declaration to be translated so quickly within the United States, but this is what happened. And these printers, Melchior Steiner and Charles Sist, they had printed Common Sense, Gesunde Vernunft. That was the translation of Common Sense. They had been printing the resolutions of the Continental Congress. They were steeped in the revolutionary vocabulary of 1776. And so their translation is a pretty good one, especially when you compare it to the translations of the Declaration in European newspapers, where they were translating word for word. You really lose some of the flavor of the Declaration when you do that. Just to give you a sense of timing, the Declaration was only known to people in Philadelphia on July 4th. It took days, if not weeks, for the Declaration to spread to other locations. So it would have taken about a week for the Declaration to get up to New England, about a week and a half or 2 weeks to get down to Virginia, a full month to get to Georgia, because at this time there were British ships in the Atlantic, so you couldn't just sail from Philadelphia to Charleston, which would have been much faster. The Declaration had to travel overland, and so that meant it took quite a bit of time. And then it took 5 weeks for the Declaration to cross the Atlantic and get to London. We'll get back to that in a moment. But being in Virginia, I wanted to give you a sense of how the Declaration was first communicated here and some of the stories behind that. As I mentioned, both of the active newspapers in Williamsburg at this time operated under the title Virginia Gazette. So in Alexander Purdy's Virginia Gazette, on July 19th, he printed an excerpt of the Declaration. And this is something which we see in European newspapers, but we don't see in any other American newspapers. So he prints just the final paragraphs of the Declaration on July 19th. And his reason for doing so is basically he didn't have enough space in his newspaper. By the time the news arrived, he had already set most of the type for the week, and so he only prints what he has room for, and he promises his readers that they'll get the full thing in his next issue. Now you can see here where the Declaration is positioned on the interior pages of the newspaper. At this time, the first and last pages of a 4-page newspaper would have been set simultaneously, and typically early in the week, because it would be longer essays or long-running advertisements, things that you could set and forget. The interior pages were where you had the timely news, typically organized from the furthest away to the closest to home. So that's why, even though Purdy, based on the change he made to his masthead, supported independence, the Declaration is on the interior pages of his newspaper. Now, as for what was taking up the rest of his newspaper, the explanation is actually that the big story in Virginia at this moment was not too far from where we are today, Gwynn's Island. This is where Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, had landed for a few weeks with his flotilla of ships, including self-emancipated, formerly enslaved people who had come to Dunmore because of his proclamation promising freedom to any enslaved people who left their masters behind and joined the British side of the conflict. So in July 1776, in this particular moment, there are really terrible reports coming from Gwynn's Island. Basically, there had been a conflict there. Dunmore had left with his ships, and what he had left behind was really gruesome. You can see here just a sampling of the reporting, which covers more than a page and a half in Purdy's newspaper. And what was coming out of Gwynn's Island from the people who went and visited after the conflict was that Dunmore had left behind bodies of enslaved people who had come to him seeking freedom and then been left behind. Here you can see this particular account says that clearly they had lost 500 people. This person counted 130 graves, or rather holes loosely covered over with earth. And there were other people who had been burnt alive as Dunmore's forces had set fire to all of the temporary structures they had built as they were leaving the island. Other reports printed in the Virginia Gazettes talked about mothers who had died while suckling their children. There's just horrors coming out of this. And the sentiment of all of these reports from Gwynn's Island is that enslaved people would have been better off on their plantations than seeking freedom with Lord Dunmore. So this is being printed not only alongside the Declaration, but in the case of Purdy's newspaper, instead of the Declaration. This was such a powerful story which reinforced the idea of some enslavers in Virginia that Dunmore was in the wrong, that it was better to keep the institution of slavery in the independent United States. And so when we think about the questions of equality and liberty and freedom that are addressed in the Declaration in Virginia, we have to think about that alongside of Lord Dunmore and what happened at Gwynn's Island. So Alexander Purdy only printed an excerpt of the Declaration on July 19th, and then the following week, he prints the full text of the Declaration in his Virginia Gazette on July 26th. And you can see by this time that he had actually added a new masthead at the top of his newspaper. So he had created a new coat of arms to really highlight an independent sort of anti-tyranny design. And so Purdy printed the Declaration in full, and in fact, he had been instructed to do so by the Virginia Assembly. And then his competitors scooped him because of the decision that he made to print an excerpt and wait until the following week to print the full thing. Here you can see Dixon and Hunter's Virginia Gazette, printed on July 20th. So Purdy had printed his excerpt on July 19th. He probably knew all too well that Dixon and Hunter would print the whole thing the next day, but he made his decision. And so you can see here that the Declaration was printed again on one of the interior pages of the newspaper, probably because it arrived late in the week and they just, made the room for it. They were already printing a smaller sized newspaper because of paper shortages at this time. But you can see the Declaration printed in full here. Now, in the book, I actually ended up with an entire chapter about Anglican ministers reacting to the Declaration. And this was the last part that I wrote because it was a sort of treasure trove of documents that I didn't come across until after I had finished my dissertation. But there's these Anglican ministers who are operating in all different places across the colonies turned United States, who have to reckon with the Declaration of Independence. These are men who had sworn an oath at their ordination in the Church of England to King George III as the head of the Church of England. And in the Book of Common Prayer, the liturgy for the Anglican Church, which was the official state church in Virginia, the Book of Common Prayer has prayers for the king to defeat his enemies. Well, his enemies are sitting in the pews of the church. So it creates a real challenging situation for ministers. And I wanted to highlight one minister from right around here on the Northern Neck, Alexander Cruden. This is a page from his application to the Loyalist Claims Commission, which was set up to basically reimburse people who had been displaced or impacted by the revolution. So Alexander Cruden had been a minister for 20-some years. And in his memorial petition to the Loyalist Claims Commission, he wrote that in the year 1776, the Americans having declared themselves independent, an order was issued by the ruling powers requiring the clergy to discontinue the prayers for the king and royal family as prescribed in the Book of Common Prayer, and to substitute in their room a prayer for the Commonwealth. And so every state kind of handled the Anglican Book of Common Prayer differently. In some cases, there was no official ruling on what ministers should do. In other places, there were recommendations that the prayers should be cut altogether. But here in Virginia, it was recommended that the prayers for the king and the royal family should be replaced with prayers for the Commonwealth and the new independent government in Virginia. And so to people like Cruden, this went against the oath that they had taken at their ordination. And so he wrote that he conceived it incompatible with his duty to his sovereign, with his oath of allegiance, and with his ordination vows, to yield obedience to the said order. And he was forced to abandon his parish in consequence of his refusal to comply. So Cruden took the path which a number of Anglican ministers took, which was instead of changing the Book of Common Prayer, to just close your church. And sometimes this was after threats of violence from community members, including in some cases ministers' own congregants. But in Cruden's case, he can't abide by changing the Book of Common Prayer, and so he just closes up his church in South Farnham. And so he writes to the Loyalist Claims Commission, having left Virginia, asking for compensation on a few different fronts. First of all, because the Anglican Church was the official church in Virginia, ministers received an annual salary from the Commonwealth in tobacco. So he was losing out on 16,000 pounds a year in tobacco. He had also given up his glebe house and property, so the sort of parsonage where he lived as minister, and about 250 acres of land. He had all of his household furniture, which he had left behind. And most interestingly, he had left behind 9 enslaved laborers, which he valued at 375 pounds. So he's trying to make a recovery of all of this lost property, including both income, land, household belongings, and people. Now, just to show you a couple of different stories, taking us out of Virginia for a bit, this is a broadside which was printed in Boston in July 1776. So you can see a sort of different formatting of the Declaration. And Boston at this time was in the middle of a smallpox quarantine. So if you were in Boston in July 1776, you had either had smallpox and were immune to it, or you were undergoing inoculation. So at this time, they thought that smallpox could spread through paper, and that makes me think that any broadsides printed in Boston probably stayed in Boston. But you can see here, if you can go to the next slide, the list of grievances is actually annotated. So the person who owned this broadside numbered the list of grievances. He lost his place toward the end of the list and wrote 25, then 27, corrected to 26. We've all done that. And then at the bottom, he signed his name, Daniel Gould, right below John Hancock's name. This is the only copy of the Declaration where I've seen someone sign their own name at the bottom. So it shows both deep reading of the Declaration, right, annotating the list of grievances, but also a deep commitment to independence. Now, if we only had these pieces, the annotations and the signature, that would be interesting enough. But thankfully, Daniel Gould left us a note on the back. So on the back of his broadside, at some later date, Daniel Gould wrote, "I bought this," excellent clue, "when the Declaration of Independence was first celebrated in Boston in 1776, when I was a soldier in the American Army." So with this evidence, I was able to figure out which Daniel Gould it was. Gould was a popular surname in Massachusetts at this time, so it actually took some effort. But because he was in Boston, a soldier in Boston, that was a really pivotal clue, because most of the Continental Army had left Boston after the British evacuation. They were down in New York or up in Canada. So there were only a few regiments that were left in Boston. And in fact, the reason why Daniel Gould was in Boston is he was a lifeguard, a personal soldier to Major General Artemus Ward, who was the commander of the remaining troops in Boston. So that's why he was there in July 1776 and purchased this broadside, which later became a sort of relic in his hometown. It was dragged out on a cart for the bicentennial of his hometown of Topsfield, Massachusetts, as sort of evidence of the town's involvement in the Revolutionary War. To stay in Massachusetts for a moment, we also have the first formal acknowledgement of the independent United States, coming around the same time, just across the river in Watertown. That's where the Massachusetts government was meeting during this smallpox quarantine in Boston. And chiefs from the Wolastoqiyik and Mi'kmaq nations up in New Brunswick and Maine had come down to Massachusetts hoping to meet with George Washington, not realizing he had moved down to New York. And so the Massachusetts government scrambles to organize a treaty meeting with these indigenous chiefs. And in the middle of the treaty meeting, the Declaration of Independence arrives. And so it's read aloud, it's translated into French for the indigenous chiefs who know that language and can further translate it. And one of the chiefs responds, and this is the first formal acknowledgement of independence. Ambrose Bierce, whose pictogram you can see at the top left, one of the Wolastoqiyik chiefs, he responded, according to the treaty minutes, "We like it well." And those 4 words are the first acknowledgement of independence by a foreign power. And they don't come from someone on the other side of the Atlantic. They come from an indigenous neighbor. The last paragraph of the Declaration was incorporated into the first paragraph of this treaty, which remains in the Massachusetts State Archives because it is still a treaty that is in effect to this day. Now, I mentioned that the Continental Congress tried to send one of the first printings of the Declaration to their secret agent in France, and that was a former delegate named Silas Deane. Silas Deane had arrived in France in July, first week of July 1776. He doesn't know what happened in Philadelphia. He assumes that the Congress has probably declared independence by the time he gets to France, but he doesn't know. And he doesn't receive a copy of the Declaration until November of 1776, by which time, as he writes here, it had indeed become an old story in every part of Europe. So what happens? How did Silas Deane, the Congress's agent in France, their most hoped for ally, not get a copy of the Declaration until November? Well, the answer is his copy was thrown overboard. So they had tried to send a copy to Silas Deane, but they had given the captain of the ship carrying it instructions that if he encountered a British vessel, he should pitch it overboard to prevent interception by the British. And of course, the ship doesn't even get out of the Delaware River when it encounters a British ship, and over the Declaration goes, and they don't send any backup copies for a month. And so Silas Deane is left, bereft and increasingly anxious because this copy had been thrown overboard. Instead of the Declaration traveling to Europe via Silas Deane and the Congress having some control over it, instead the Declaration travels very quickly on British mail ships from New York to London. And so the Declaration takes about 5 weeks to cross the Atlantic from New York to London, and then from there, it's printed all across Europe in European newspapers, but mediated by those printers in London. You can see here the first newspaper printing of the Declaration in London, printed on August 16th. Henry Sampson Woodfall's Public Advertiser had the full text of the Declaration. And then that same day in the evening, as the name of the newspaper suggests, the Declaration was printed in Lloyd's Evening Post, but it looked a little bit different because some of the references to the king were replaced with long dashes. So you can see here that king, tyrant, prince, all those words have been replaced. It doesn't really impact the reader's experience. You can fill in the dots, you can figure out who they're talking about. But it's just an example to start of how London printers treated this text, because the Declaration is all about King George III, and that makes it dangerous to print in London. So printers are self-censoring and excerpting and manipulating the text. One of the most interesting examples is the St. James's Chronicle, printed on August 17th, where in the list of grievances, the pronouns were changed from he has to it has. Now, what's it? Is it Great Britain? Is it Parliament? Is it the British government? It's not entirely clear. This would have taken a tremendous amount of work. It's not just a matter of switching one word in each line that impacts the entire sentence structure. So this was someone who really put the time in to making sure that the Declaration was not about King George III. It's a fascinating example of a self-censorship tactic. And these tactics were then copied by printers on the other side of the English Channel. So just to give you an example, this is the Haarlem Courant, a Dutch newspaper. And you can see that the references to the king, the asterisks and long dashes have been replicated from what was in the London press. And then the note that's bracketed there replaces the list of grievances. And this was one of the strategies which printers used in London. Let's just skip over the list of grievances. And they add a note saying here, the Congress repeated their previous complaints and things from previous petitions. And that was a way of shortening the text, but also skipping over the most egregious part of it. Unfortunately for Johannes Enschede, the printer of the Haarlem Courant, his readers actually wanted to see the list of grievances about King George III. So in the next issue, he had to print an apology to his readers saying, I didn't realize that you wanted to see the middle of the Declaration, and so I'll print it for you now. But because he had censored the references to the king the first time around, here in the first grievance, he has to explain who he is. So he writes he, and then in parentheses, namely, the king. So it's an interesting example of how the decisions made in one place impact how the news is received in other places. Now, the book concludes, as I mentioned, with one particular printing in January 1777. And these were broadsides created by Mary Catherine Goddard in Baltimore. That's where the Continental Congress was meeting by this time. They had evacuated Philadelphia for fear of a British attack on the city. And while they were in Baltimore, they decided to create copies of the Declaration that would preserve the names of the men who had signed the parchment copy by this time. It's an important caveat because Thomas McKean's name is missing from Goddard's broadside. He was one of Delaware's delegates, but he had not yet signed the parchment copy of the Declaration when Goddard created her broadsides. In fact, he may not have signed the Declaration until as late as 1781. So it's another reminder that these men were never in the same room at the same time, and the names were added over time by these men who wanted to pledge their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. But Goddard's broadsides were meant to be sent out to each of the states to form the foundation of each state's archive. And so that's why they mark the end of this period of time when the Declaration is news, and this transition to what we think of today, the Declaration being in the archive, in the museum, behind glass, a treasured object, very different from the time when it was news. If you are interested in more of the stories behind the Declaration, you're welcome to check out more information about the book. And I should also add that here for Northern Neck 250, I've given you the Virginia perspective, but I'm traveling all over the place and sharing different stories as I go. So if you're interested in other upcoming events, you can check out emilysneff.com. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions.